If the mock nuclear drills being carried out by Russia were not enough, Moscow has signaled a bigger escalation in Ukraine. Moscow has warned the North Atlantic Treaty Organization countries that convoys carrying NATO weapons to Ukraine will be targeted. They will be treated as legitimate military targets in Ukraine. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization has been supplying weapon systems and warlike stores, including ammunition and spares, to the armed forces in Ukraine. The question is, does this signal this war entering a very dangerous and escalatory phase now?
71 days into the Ukraine war, with town after town and city after city either reduced to rubble or falling to Russian hands, Putin has issued a warning that has the potential to make this a much bigger conflict than it already is. The warning articulated by Russia's defense minister.
The United States and its NATO allies are continuing to pump weapons into Ukraine. I want to mention that we view any transport to the North Atlantic Alliance arriving on territory of the country destined to Ukraine army as a legitimate target to be destroyed.
What the Russian defense minister has said is already sending shockwaves. The Russian military has repeatedly conducted strikes on Ukrainian depots containing Western weapons. But actually striking Western transports delivering those weapons would mark a significant escalation in this conflict. The Russian warning is therefore a direct threat to the larger security situation in Europe. So far, NATO has played a support role in Ukraine, shipping containers full of advanced weapons and ammunition, military hardware and combat supplies across the Polish border into Ukraine. NATO has also played a second critical but invisible role, aiding Ukrainian defense forces with satellite data, targeting intelligence and sensor access to help attack Russian positions and assets with accuracy. If NATO vehicles and trucks carrying weapons become legitimate targets to the Russians, does that mean that NATO will be forced to hit back when attacked? And if that happens, what is the nature of the escalation ladder? And where will it actually end? Bureau Report, India Today.
And for the latest on this big story, I quickly want to cut across to India Today's Foreign Affairs editor Geeta Mohan joining us from Crimea. We also have India Today's editor Defense Abhishek Bhalla joining us from Ukraine's capital Kiev. And Geeta, this warning issued by Russia, NATO convoys will be considered as a legitimate military target. How serious is Russia on day 71 of this conflict to check the weapons that are coming into Ukraine?
Well, Gaurav, the parameters of threat and escalation keep changing according to what Russia considers threat. Over here, NATO armaments reaching heavy weapons entering Ukraine was not considered absolute threat. Of course, it was an escalation to an extent, and Russia kept saying they're monitoring what is being sent to Ukraine. But anything that goes beyond the borders of Poland and other countries into Ukraine becomes Ukrainian unless the manpower, that's the forces and personnel on the are going to be NATO. If that happens, that is a real escalation. But over here, Russia has also said that the escalation is going to be on the basis of what the weaponry is going to be, and if should there be severe damage to Russia and Russian assets because of the NATO weaponry, because of the NATO ammunition, then that Russia will certainly consider an escalation and a huge threat. But does that mean existential threat? Not really at this point in time. It just means it is an escalation. But if NATO intervenes by sending forces into Ukrainian territory, even to operate the weaponry, that certainly would be a threat and an escalation to the extent where Russia will say this is existential crisis for Russia. So for now, the escalation only, and the focus is not to counter NATO armaments coming in the west of Ukraine. The focus is eastern Ukraine, where they're continuing their fight, and they're continuing to increase the and capture the space in eastern Ukraine and eastern territories of Ukraine. So that should be Ukraine's bigger worry, and for Russia, that certainly is the bigger focus.
Okay. So was it then a deception attack on Kiev actually ensure that the Ukrainian forces are divided, launch a deception attack on Kiev and then target the eastern part and take away, slice away territory? Is that what is happening on ground? Abhishek, as far as military hardware is coming, we are told now bigger caliber weapons, deadlier weapons are coming into Ukraine. The targeting of railway infrastructure, the targeting of electric infrastructure, the targeting of roads, is that seen as a pattern to stop weapons and systems coming in?
Well, Russia has already sounded a warning that anything carrying weapons to Ukraine is a potential target. And, one can understand why Russia has done this, because, there has been a long list, a wish list provided by Ukraine to its partners, and all those things, all the items on that wish list include some of the heavy platforms, military platforms that Ukraine needs, including artillery, guns, drones, tanks, armor vehicles. So if all of that is to come to Ukraine, then that means Ukraine is preparing for not just a defensive action, but perhaps an offensive posture in the long run. And if Russia is to attack anything that is coming from NATO countries, then obviously that would mean a big escalation in this war, and it's anybody's guess what would happen if NATO forces backed by the US were to respond in such a scenario. Things would really get out of hand. So it remains to be seen how things pan out in days to come in a war that seems to be not ending anytime soon.